In a small house in Amherst, Nova Scotia, something seemed to choose one young woman and make her the center of a nightmare. Not strange dreams, not shadows in the dark. Something louder, crueler, more violent. Something that rattled walls, moved objects, started fires, and turned one frightened woman's terror into one of the darkest haunting cases in Canadian history. And at the center of it all was Esther Cox. If the witnesses were telling the truth, then whatever entered that house was not subtle. It did not stay hidden. It seemed to want fear, and it seemed to want Esther. Amherst in the late 19th century was quiet, small, and ordinary. Wooden houses, coal stoves, dim lamps, narrow rooms that grew heavier after dark. Esther lived there with members of her family in a modest home, where life should have felt predictable. But something happened that seemed to split her life in two. According to the best-known version of the story, Esther suffered a violent shock after an attempted assault by a man named Bob McNeil. She escaped, but she did not come away unchanged. Those around her said she became deeply distressed, frightened, and unsettled, as if something inside her had been pushed to a breaking point. Then the disturbances began. At first, they sounded like things people try to explain away. Knocks, thumps, strange sounds in the walls. But they did not stop. They grew more frequent, more direct, more threatening. Then came the bed. One night, with others present, Esther's bedclothes reportedly began to move and lift as if something underneath them was forcing its way upward. The bed itself shook hard enough to terrify everyone in the room, and Esther's condition seemed to grow worse. Witnesses described her swelling, her face reddening, her body reacting in panic as if something unseen were attacking her. The room no longer felt merely strange. It felt hostile. Then came the words that made the story unforgettable. On the wall appeared the message, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." Whether it was supernatural, staged, or something stranger in between, the effect was the same. From that point on, the case became personal. The disturbances were no longer just happening around Esther. They were happening to her. Objects reportedly flew across rooms. Boxes moved. Loud raps burst from the walls. Household items were said to shift without explanation. At times, it seemed as if the force in the house had fixed itself to Esther and would not let go. And then there were fires. Small fires reportedly broke out in clothing, bedding, and other places that should not have ignited so easily. Each new incident made the house feel less like a home and more like a trap. By then, the story had spread. Neighbors came. Curious visitors came. Some came to help. Others came because fear is hard to ignore once it takes hold in public. Among the witnesses was Walter Hubble, who later wrote the account that made the case famous. He claimed to have seen enough to believe that something beyond ordinary explanation was happening in the house. But where there are witnesses, there is also doubt. Skeptics believed Esther was responsible, or that the case had been exaggerated or staged. Some saw a terrified young woman overwhelmed by trauma. Others saw a hoax that grew larger with every retelling. That tension is part of what keeps the case alive, because the story never settled into certainty. At one point, Esther left the house, but the trouble was said to follow her. That detail made the case even darker. If the house itself was haunted, leaving should have ended it. If the disturbance followed Esther, then the nightmare was tied to her, not the building. Eventually, another fire brought the case to a breaking point. Esther was accused of setting a barn blaze and served a short time in prison. After that, the great disturbances seemed to stop. No more famous knockings, no more messages on the wall, no more public scenes of panic and violence. And that ending only made the mystery stranger. If it was a haunting, why did it end there? If it was a hoax, how did it convince so many people for so long? If it was trauma erupting in a world that had no language for trauma, then what exactly were all those witnesses seeing when they stood in that house and watched fear gather around Esther Cox? That is why the Great Amherst Mystery still lingers. Not because it proves the supernatural, not because it is easy to believe, because it feels like one of those cases where something real happened, but the truth was buried under fear, memory, trauma, and doubt. A young woman said something had come for her. The house answered with knocks, fire, and violence. Witnesses said they saw enough to believe. And behind all the arguments, haunting, fraud, hysteria, trauma, there remains one darker possibility: that Esther Cox was telling the truth in the only way she could, and that for a time, in a narrow house in Amherst, something unseen decided she belonged to it.